What drives a person to willingly surrender their life to be consumed by another human being? And perhaps more disturbing, what psychological mechanism allows someone to fulfill that request? As a society, we've developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding violence. We categorize killers, we profile them, we study their childhoods, their traumas, their neurological abnormalities. But the case I'm about to discuss defies nearly every conventional model of criminal psychology. In January 2025, in a government building in northern Vietnam, a man named Nguyen Xuan Dat positioned himself on a wooden chopping block. He wasn't restrained. He wasn't drugged. He was, by all accounts, fully aware of what was about to happen. And in the moments before his death, he expressed something that looked to observers of the footage remarkably like anticipation. The man who killed him, Don Van Sang, a 58-year-old retired government official, wasn't a stranger. They had spent years communicating online, carefully planning every detail of what would become one of the most psychologically complex criminal cases in recent memory. This video is not about the graphic details of what happened. You can find sensationalized accounts of this case elsewhere. Instead, I want to explore the far more unsettling questions that lie beneath the surface. How do two people arrive at this arrangement? What psychological needs does it serve, and what does this case reveal about the dark corners of human desire that most of us prefer to believe don't exist? Fair warning, while I won't be showing any disturbing imagery, the psychological content of this discussion may be deeply unsettling. This is an examination of the human mind at its most extreme. In 1920, Sigmund Freud introduced a concept that disturbed even his most loyal followers, thanatos, the death drive. Freud proposed that alongside our instinct for survival and pleasure, eros, there exists an equally powerful force pulling us towards self destruction, dissolution, and ultimately death. For a century, this theory remained controversial, often dismissed as philosophical speculation rather than clinical observation. But cases like Nguyen Xuan Dat's force us to reconsider. Here was a man who didn't simply want to die. He wanted to be consumed, to cease existing in the most literal way possible. Dat was 36 years old when he died. According to messages uncovered by online investigators, he had been obsessed with his own death since at least 2019. But his fixation wasn't suicidal in the conventional sense. Traditional suicidality typically involves escape from pain, from circumstances, from unbearable psychological states. Dot's desire was something altogether different. Clinical literature contains a rare paraphilia known as vorophilia, sexual fascination with the fantasy of being eaten or consuming another person. In the vast majority of cases, this remains purely fantasy expressed through artwork, fiction, or role play communities. The leap from fantasy to reality is extraordinarily rare, documented in only a handful of cases worldwide. What distinguished Dat was his determination to cross that line. In forum posts recovered after his death, he described his fantasy with remarkable specificity to be decapitated at the moment of sexual climax by a female executioner, then consumed. He referred to this as his ultimate wish. From a psychological perspective, several elements stand out. First, the fusion of eros and thanatos. Sexual pleasure and death intertwine so completely that one becomes impossible without the other. Second, the element of surrender, the complete relinquishing of agency to another person. Third, the transformation death, as metamorphosis becoming part of another being rather than simply ceasing to exist. Dat's psychological profile fits a pattern familiar to clinicians: profound social isolation combined with immersion in online communities that normalize extreme content. In one message, he reportedly wrote, "Not only am I unattractive, but I am also afflicted with illnesses. I can't afford to live like ordinary people. I have I have lied on my parents all my life. What else was left for me? I am truly captive to my own destiny." This statement reveals several psychological dynamics. There's the learned helplessness, the belief that his circumstances were fixed and unchangeable. There's the profound shame about being dependent on his family well into adulthood. And there's what psychologists call cognitive constriction, the narrowing of perceived options until an extreme choice begins to seem like the only logical path. When Dat's mother, who reportedly struggles with mental health challenges herself, lost contact with him years before his death, he became increasingly untethered from conventional social bonds. Without family, without intimate relationships, without professional identity, he drifted deeper into online communities where his darkest impulses were not only accepted but celebrated. The internet has created something unprecedented in human history communities of like minded individuals for virtually any interest, no matter how niche or extreme. For most interests, this is benign or even beneficial. But for dangerous paraphilias, it creates what researchers call deviance amplification. Dot frequented forums dedicated to decapitation fantasies, cannibalism, roleplay, and extreme body modification. On these platforms, he wasn't pathological, he was understood. His desires weren't shameful, they were shared. He even commissioned Vietnamese translations of Japanese Eroguro manga depicting his exact fantasy. In this environment, the taboo gradually erodes. What begins as private fantasy becomes shared interest. Shared interest becomes community. Community becomes identity. And once something is identity, it becomes nearly impossible to abandon. To reject the community would mean rejecting oneself. The psychological research on this is clear. Social validation, even from anonymous online strangers, has profound effects on behavior. When Dat's ultimate wish was met with encouragement rather than horror, when others shared similar desires, when he found potential partners willing to make it reality, the unthinkable began to seem not just possible, but inevitable. Doan Van Sang lived a double life for over 2 decades. To the outside world, he was a model citizen, a retired deputy leader of a market management department, head of a prominent family clan with thousands of members, a married father of two with strong government connections. He was respected, he was trusted, he held positions of authority. This duality is not unprecedented in the annals of criminal psychology. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was a church president and Boy Scout leader. John Wayne Gacy performed as a clown at children's parties. The capacity to compartmentalize, to maintain a socially acceptable persona while nurturing violent fantasies is a hallmark of certain personality structures. What's particularly chilling about Sang's case is the duration. Digital forensics traced his online activity back approximately 20 years. His interests evolved gradually from seeking casual encounters on gay forums to cultivating a dominant persona to fantasizing about cutting and consuming human flesh. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was the culmination of 2 decades of psychological development. Forensic psychologists have documented a common pattern in violent offenders' escalation. What begins as fantasy progresses to increasingly realistic simulations, then to minor boundary violations, then to more serious ones, until finally the ultimate act becomes possible. In Sang's case, the escalation pathway is documented in his digital footprint. His early online presence focused on dominance and humiliation fantasies. Over time, these gave way to discussions of actual violence. By 2022, 3 years before the murder, he was posting photographs of dismembered bodies on forums images whose origin remains unknown. He also attempted to purchase severed body parts from suppliers, allegedly remnants of gender affirmation surgeries. Each step served as both desensitization and testing. Could he look at these images without revulsion? Could he possess such items? Could he engage with communities that discussed these acts? Each affirmative answer was permission to proceed to the next step. Perhaps the most psychologically significant aspect of this case is how Sang framed his actions and likely how he understood them internally. In his confession, he portrayed himself almost as a service provider, someone merely fulfilling another person's request. He claimed Dat repeatedly encouraged him, that Dat offered money for the arrangement, that he was, in essence, manipulated. This narrative serves multiple psychological functions. It diffuses responsibility. He was doing what someone asked, not acting on his own desires. It transforms predation into cooperation. It reframes murder as euthanasia, cannibalism, as respect for the deceased's wishes. But the evidence tells a different story. Just 2 weeks after killing Dot Sang was actively attempting to recruit another victim, the whistleblower who would eventually help expose him. This wasn't a one time accommodation of someone else's fantasy. It was investigators believe the beginning of what he intended to be a pattern. It's worth examining what we know about Sang's professional life because it may offer psychological insights. He was a government bureaucrat, someone whose entire career involved regulatory control, inspecting, approving, denying, punishing. His position gave him authority over others, the power to determine outcomes in their lives. The murder took place in his own workplace, a government building during the Lunar New Year holiday when the building was empty. He volunteered to stay for 5 days, ensuring he would have complete privacy. The choice of location suggests something beyond mere convenience. There may be a psychological significance to exercising his darkest impulses in the same space where he exercised legitimate authority. The methodical nature of the act also reflects a bureaucratic mindset. The rehearsal filmed beforehand, the multiple camera angles, the systematic dismemberment that followed. The disposal plan, involving crushing bones, boiling flesh, and distributing remains across multiple locations. This wasn't frenzied violence. It was organized, procedural, almost administrative in its execution. The temptation is to label someone like Sang a psychopath and move on. But clinical psychopathy, characterized by lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulation, and impulsivity, doesn't fully explain this case. Sang maintained long term relationships and family bonds. His crimes were not impulsive, but elaborately planned over years. His online personas suggest he was capable of forming connections, however disturbed, with others who shared his interests. What seems more likely is a combination of paraphilic disorders, specifically erotophonophilia, sexual arousal from killing, and vorophilia combined with antisocial traits that allowed him to override the normal inhibitions against harming others. The consensual frame may have been crucial here, providing just enough moral justification to allow him to proceed. There's also a possibility of sadistic personality features deriving pleasure specifically from the suffering and death of others, regardless of consent. The fact that he continued the relationship with Dat's online community after the murder, sending messages from Dat's accounts taunting investigators with laughing emojis when they expressed frustration. These suggest someone who enjoys the game, who derives satisfaction from power over others, even beyond the grave. To understand the psychological dynamics between Dat and Sang, we must look at the only comparable cases in modern history. The most famous is that of Armin Meiwes and Bernd Brandes in Germany, 2001. Meiwes, who fantasized about consuming another person, posted advertisements online seeking a willing victim. Brandes answered. The two men met, filmed the killing and partial consumption, and Meiwes ate portions of Brandes' body over the following months. When the case came to trial, it posed unprecedented legal and psychological questions. How do you prosecute a killing when the victim not only consented but actively sought out their killer? The Vietnamese case presents similar challenges. Dat sought out his own death. He brought the murder weapons, he positioned himself for execution, he expressed what appeared to be satisfaction in his final moments. In some sense, Sang gave him exactly what he asked for. And yet, in another sense, this framing obscures something crucial: the power differential, the exploitation, and the predatory nature of the relationship. Psychiatry recognizes a phenomenon called folie deux, literally madness of two, in which a delusion or disturbed behavior is transmitted from one person to another through close association. While this typically refers to psychotic beliefs, some researchers have extended the concept to shared paraphilias and mutual escalation of disturbed behavior. Dat and Sang communicated for approximately 5 years before the killing. During this time, they reinforced each other's fantasies. They planned together. They rehearsed. They created a shared narrative in which what they were doing was not only acceptable, but meaningful, even romantic in its own perverse way. This mutual reinforcement is crucial. Neither man in isolation might have proceeded to act, but together they created a reality in which the act became possible. The presence of a willing partner transformed fantasy into destiny. This case forces us to grapple with deeply uncomfortable questions about autonomy and consent. That was not a child. He was not intellectually disabled. He was not, by available evidence, acutely psychotic. He pursued his death deliberately over years with full knowledge of what would happen. Does that make him a victim or an author of his own fate? The legal answer is clear. No jurisdiction permits killing by consent outside narrow medical contexts. But the psychological question is more complex. If someone's deepest desire is for their own death, and that desire is fulfilled exactly as they wished, have they been harmed? Most psychologists would argue yes for several reasons. First, the desire itself was pathological, the product of mental illness, isolation, and distorted development. A truly healthy person does not want to be killed and eaten. Second, the capacity for consent may be compromised, even in the absence of obvious impairment. Depression, paraphilia, and years of echo chamber reinforcement can distort decision making. Third, consent obtained in this context is fundamentally different from informed consent. It's consent shaped by manipulation, community pressure, and the exploitation of vulnerability. Despite the consent narrative, there's a fundamental asymmetry in this relationship that suggests predation. That was vulnerable, isolated, dependent, mentally struggling. Sang was established, married, employed, connected. It operating from a position of stability. That sought death. Sang sought a victim. Sang's post murder behavior makes this dynamic clear. He continued to use Dat's social media accounts communicating with Dat's contacts. He sought out new potential victims, including the whistleblower. He infiltrated the online investigation into his own crime, mocking the efforts to find him. This is not the behavior of someone who reluctantly fulfilled a dying wish. This is the behavior of a predator who enjoyed the hunt and immediately began searching for new prey. From this perspective, Dat was not a partner, but a resource, someone whose psychological vulnerabilities made him accessible, whose consent provided cover, and whose death provided both satisfaction and material for profit. The footage was sold. The fantasy became product. This case would not have been possible without the internet. That statement might seem obvious, but its implications deserve careful examination. The digital world didn't create the psychological conditions that drove Dat and Sangthos existed before any platform, but it did something perhaps equally dangerous. It connected them. Before the internet, someone with Dat's desires might have lived their entire life believing they were uniquely disturbed. That isolation, while painful, also served as a natural barrier to acting on extreme fantasies. Without validation, without community, without practical knowledge of how to make contact with others who shared the interest, the fantasy typically remained fantasy. The internet removed each of these barriers systematically. It provided validation through community. It offered practical knowledge through forums and file sharing. It created marketplaces for extreme content. And crucially, it enabled connection between willing victims and potential perpetrators across vast distances. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is its commercial dimension. The footage wasn't created purely for personal satisfaction, it was packaged and sold. On Telegram channels, the complete set of 11 videos and 98 images was reportedly priced at up to $600. Basic access cost around $100. This commercial element adds another psychological layer to consider. There was an audience for this content. There were buyers. There were distributors, apparently Chinese speaking parties, who marketed the material on encrypted platforms. The killing wasn't just the fulfillment of two individuals' disturbed desires, it was content production for a market. This raises the possibility investigated by journalists at Vice that the case represents something unprecedented, genuine snuff content produced specifically for commercial distribution. While the definition is debated, the implications are clear. Where there's a market, there's incentive. Where there's incentive, there's potential for more production. Perhaps the most unsettling psychological implication of this case is what it suggests about the broader landscape. The Vietnamese butcher footage was sold through networks that apparently have been active for years. One distributor's message, uncovered by investigators, advertised a stable community with tens of thousands of members offering content, including corpse dumping, body dismemberment, executions, and necrophilia. If this is accurate, then Dat and Sang were not isolated aberrations. They were participants in an ecosystem, dark web of production, distribution, and consumption that operates globally, largely invisible to mainstream awareness. The psychological implications are profound. Each piece of content in such networks represents real harm to real people. Each consumer provides financial incentive for more production. And the anonymity of these networks means that producers, distributors, and consumers can operate with minimal fear of consequences. A situation that traditional criminology would predict leads to escalation over time. The technologies that enable privacy and free expression also enable exploitation and violence. Telegram VPN's cryptocurrency each serves legitimate purposes, but each also provides cover for networks like those involved in this case. From a psychological perspective, anonymity has a well documented disinhibiting effect. People say and do things online they would never do in person. The removal of identity removes accountability, and without accountability, internal constraints weaken. A person who might hesitate to purchase illegal content in person may have no such hesitation when the transaction is anonymous and encrypted. This disinhibition compounds over time. Each purchase normalizes the next. Each piece of content viewed desensitizes to the next. The gradual erosion of internal barriers that characterize Sang's 20-year journey may be occurring simultaneously in thousands of other users, each moving along their own trajectory toward increasingly extreme engagement. The resolution of this case came not from police work, but from a Facebook community. The OSINT Vietnam Group, operating under pseudonyms for safety, compiled over 100 pages of evidence through open source investigation. They identified the victim. They traced the perpetrator. They documented the crime scene. They built a case that authorities initially seemed reluctant to pursue. This phenomenon, citizen investigation of extreme crimes, has its own psychological dimensions worth examining. What drives someone to spend hours, days, weeks investigating the most disturbing content imaginable? The motivations likely vary. Some seek justice, some are drawn by morbid fascination, some find purpose in using their skills for good. But there's also risk. Exposure to extreme content has documented psychological effects. Investigators, professional and amateur alike, can develop secondary trauma, intrusive thoughts, desensitization, or paradoxically, hypervigilance and anxiety. The members of the OSINT group operated anonymously in part for safety, but also perhaps because deep engagement with such material carries its own stigma. One of the most psychologically fascinating elements of this case was Sang's behavior during the investigation. He infiltrated the very Facebook group tracking him. He read threads. He commented on updates. He posted laughing emojis when investigators expressed frustration. This behavior suggests narcissistic traits, a sense of superiority, a belief that he was smarter than those pursuing him, a thrill derived from watching others struggle to find him while he hid in plain sight. When he was finally identified, his response was telling, "I am the executioner. Who dares to catch me?" This taunt posted publicly suggests someone who had come to believe in his own invulnerability. After decades of operating without consequences, after committing the ultimate transgression and apparently getting away with it, he may have genuinely believed he was untouchable. The shock of exposure may have been as much to his self image as to his freedom. For months after the footage appeared online, Vietnamese authorities took no apparent action. Comments calling for investigation were reportedly deleted from official police pages. Some attributed this to negligence. Others suspected a desire to protect Vietnam's image. Still others pointed to possible corruption given Sang's government connections. Whatever the cause, this institutional failure has its own psychological implications. For the citizen investigators, it created both frustration and motivation. Their efforts felt necessary because the system had failed. For the broader public, it reinforced cynicism about institutions. And for anyone contemplating similar crimes, it sent a dangerous message: the system might not come for you. The eventual arrest came only after the 106-page dossier went viral after international attention made inaction impossible. This pattern requiring public pressure to force institutional response is troublingly common in cases involving powerful perpetrators. Both Dat and Sang needed intervention that never came. Dat's psychological deterioration happened largely in publicist forum posts documented years of escalating fixation on death. Sang's parallel journey occurred more privately, but his online activity left traces that, in retrospect, suggested danger. In an ideal mental health system, Dat might have found treatment for his depression, social isolation, and paraphilic interests before they consumed him. Sang might have been identified as someone whose fantasies required monitoring and intervention. But mental health systems, even in wealthy countries, are ill equipped to identify and treat such cases. In Vietnam, resources are more limited still. This case illustrates a broader truth: our psychological safety nets are designed for common problems: anxiety, depression, standard presentations of psychosis. When someone falls outside these categories, when their pathology is rare, stigmatized, and deliberately hidden, they often fall through completely. Could this case have been prevented? The honest answer is probably not, given current systems. Dat and Sang operated on platforms beyond the reach of most authorities. Their communications were encrypted, their communities were anonymous. By the time anyone outside their circle knew what was happening, it had already happened. Prevention would require interventions that don't currently exist at scale: online platforms that can identify escalating dangerous content without destroying privacy, mental health outreach that reaches isolated individuals before they find extreme communities, legal frameworks that can operate across borders and platforms, and perhaps most importantly, social conditions that produce fewer isolated, desperate people seeking meaning in darkness. Cases like this one tempt us toward comfortable explanations. We want Dat to be uniquely damaged, Sang to be uniquely evil. We want to believe that we and the people we love could never be involved in something like this, as victim or perpetrator. But the psychological research suggests more troubling conclusions. The mechanisms that drove Dat and Sang's isolation echo chambers, gradual desensitization, the exploitation of vulnerability, are not rare. They operate in less extreme forms across countless communities and contexts. Most people who experience them do not end up in cases like this one, but the path that led here is not as foreign as we might want to believe. The internet has revealed and perhaps amplified aspects of human psychology that previous generations could more easily ignore: the capacity for extreme violence, the desire for death, the willingness to profit from suffering. These are not new, but they are more visible than ever, and in some cases more accessible. As I conclude this analysis, Doan Van Sang sits in custody facing potential execution for his crimes. The citizen investigators who exposed him have returned to anonymity. The platforms that enabled this case continue to operate, and somewhere in forums and channels most of us will never see, others are likely planning similar acts. I began this video by asking what drives a person to willingly surrender their life to be consumed by another. The psychological answer is complex isolation, pathology echo chambers, gradual escalation, and a deep human need for meaning, even if that meaning is found in death. The question of what drives someone to fulfill such a request is similarly complex: power, paraphilia, years of escalation, the rationalization of consent, and perhaps something fundamental about human capacity for violence that we prefer not to examine too closely. What this case ultimately reveals is not that monsters exist. We knew that already. It reveals the infrastructure that supports them: the digital platforms, the communities, the markets, the institutional failures, and the social conditions that produce vulnerable people and predators alike. The Vietnamese butcher case is extreme, but it is not, I fear, unique. It may be a harbinger of a type of crime that our digital age makes increasingly possible: planned, documented, commercialized, and enabled by the same technologies that connect us in beneficial ways. Understanding the psychology behind such cases is not voyeurism, it is necessary, because prevention requires understanding, and understanding requires looking at what we would rather not see. If there is any redemption in this story, it lies with the citizen investigators who refused to let it disappear. They proved that even the darkest corners of the internet are not beyond accountability, that determined people working together can bring truth to light even when institutions fail. That may be the most important psychological lesson of all: evil thrives on silence and darkness. The antidote is not to look away, but to look carefully, understand clearly, and ensure that such acts do not go unmarked or unremembered. Nguyen Xuan Dat was 36 years old. Whatever path led him to that bathroom floor, he was someone's son. In the end, that simple fact matters more than any psychological analysis can capture. This analysis draws on publicly available information compiled by the OSINT and Cyber Investigation Vietnam community, whose careful documentation made understanding this case possible. It also references reporting by Vice and research by the Vietnamese YouTuber known as The Curious One, KTM. While I have attempted to approach this material with appropriate psychological rigor, I am presenting an analysis, not a clinical evaluation. The individuals involved were not available for interview, and the psychological interpretations offered here are necessarily speculative, informed by general clinical knowledge and the available evidence. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self harm, disturbing fantasies, or isolation, please seek help. Mental health support is available in most countries through crisis lines and mental health services. The path that led to this case began with treatable conditions: isolation, depression, untreated paraphilia. Intervention is possible. I strongly advise against seeking out any of the media discussed in this video. It is deeply disturbing, potentially illegal to possess depending on your jurisdiction, and viewing such content has documented negative psychological effects, even for trained professionals. Thank you for engaging with difficult material in the spirit of understanding rather than sensationalism. The goal of this analysis has been to illuminate, not to exploit, to honor the complexity of human psychology even in its darkest manifestations.